The narrative for the translation of the Book of Mormon that is best supported by the accounts of individuals involved in its translation is that God revealed the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith word by word. Consider this account shared by Russell M. Nelson in a rare 20th century acknowledgement of the use of a seer stone in a hat. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. Thus the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, and not by any power of man. Considering an omnipotent God is revealing the words one at a time to Joseph Smith, as attested to by the current prophet and president of the church, that makes it curious that the title page of the Book of Mormon contains the following disclaimer. And now if there are faults, they are the mistakes of men. Wherefore condemn not the things of God, that ye may be found spotless at the judgment seat of Christ. Surely any errors of the ancient authors could have been corrected during the translation process. That disclaimer at the beginning of the book seems to be an example of something that is sometimes called the preface paradox. I first heard about this when Alex O'Connor outlined it as follows.
Have you heard of the preface paradox?
No.
This is quite interesting. Like at the beginning of a book, authors will say something like, any mistakes in here. They basically apologize for mistakes. They say any mistakes are, my own fault, sorry, my bad, But the thing is, they'll have gone through their entire book and checked every line to make sure everything's correct. And yet still they'll think, although I've gone through every line and it's all correct, I still think at least somewhere I've made a mistake. They couldn't tell you where the mistake is because they've gone through every single time, and yet they still think they've made at least one mistake. So a better way of thinking about this is, think of all of the true beliefs that you hold, all of the beliefs that you have that you think are true. Do you think that one of them, at least one of them, is in fact false?
It have to be.
Sure.
Yeah.
But if I asked you to go one by one through every belief you think is true, you say that's true, that's true, that's true, because you think that they're true. And yet after telling me this is true, this is true, this is true, and this is true, but at least one of them is false. Yeah. How does it? It seems to be a paradox, and it's probably got something to do with the fact that when you believe something is true, it's like probability. You're never like 100% sure. But it's sort of a fake paradox. But it's interesting to think about. You think that all of these are true, and yet at least one of them is false.
As we've established, the title page of the Book of Mormon contains just such a preemptive statement about errors. But I think we can dig into this deeper. Just as Alex described about people's personally held beliefs, if you were to ask a member of the church, particularly an apologist, if there are any mistakes in the Book of Mormon, they will say, of course there are. Just look at this from Fair Mormon. Does the Book of Mormon contain errors? Yes, it does, and so does every other printed document on the planet. And why wouldn't they admit to mistakes? The title page of the Book of Mormon warns that there may be some. But when apologists are pressed on each of the mistakes in turn, they would be more likely than not to try and first prove how it isn't a mistake at all, or failing that, try and prove that the mistake is somehow inconsequential. Here's perhaps a better example of this paradox for broader church membership and not just apologists. When someone like me calls out the leaders of the church for lying, a common response is that the church is led by fallible men. We do not believe in prophetic infallibility. Now, far from the fact that the prophet of the church claims to speak directly for a deity,
do you know what the word prophet means? He speaks for God.
and that this is reinforced in LDS scripture, what I the Lord have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself. And though the heavens and the earth pass away, my words shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. Members of the church, like my stake president for example, will ignore all that and claim the church is led by a fallible prophet and fallible leaders. But then, when they are confronted with an example of such fallibility, they are very often reluctant to admit or acknowledge individual mistakes made by church leaders. They are willing to admit in theory to the fallibility of church leaders to try and make the issue of their poor behaviour disappear, but in reality they will seek to defend specific examples of that aforementioned fallibility, even though they are willing to acknowledge that fallibility as a generalized concept. It's sort of like saying, of course red cars exist in theory, but every time one drives past, you say it's actually pink or that you didn't really see it. Maybe you're just colorblind, or maybe you just don't want your hypothetical red car to exist because of whatever scary reality that may bring with it. Put another way, if I claim to be imperfect, but but then refuse to acknowledge any imperfections, I'm operating in practice as though my initial claim was false. Similarly, while Mormons claim their leaders are fallible in theory, in practice they operate as though they aren't. It is functionally the same as saying someone is infallible to say they are fallible but refuse to accept any examples of when they have been so. It is a necessary condition of being fallible that one must have done something in error or be capable of doing so, and the chances of Russell M. Nelson making no mistakes in his 100-year life are so vanishingly small that it is this statistical improbability that leads many members to accept that he's most likely fallible in the first place. So if you want to check if someone is buying into this paradox, next time you're having a conversation with someone who says, well, of course church leaders are fallible, just say, okay, can you give me some examples of when they've been fallible? And then just watch them squirm. And once they're done squirming, tell them to come and subscribe to my channel. And so that you're not a hypocrite, you should probably also subscribe for yourself.